You cannot choose the family you are born into, but you absolutely get to choose how long you let them disrespect you. My name is Kendra. I am 28 years old, and for the vast majority of my life, I was the designated black sheep of a family that worshipped nothing but money, social status, and perfectly curated illusions. My father, Donovan, was a terrifyingly arrogant man who played two very different roles. On Sundays, he was the charismatic senior pastor of a sprawling megachurch in Atlanta, preaching about grace, humility, and family values to thousands of gullible followers who hung on his every word. Monday through Saturday, he was the tyrannical, ruthless CEO of a massive logistics and transport empire. He ruled our household with an iron fist, demanding absolute perfection and complete submission. Beside him was my mother, Camilla. She was a woman who practically breathed country club elitism. Her entire identity was wrapped up in expensive designer labels, high society charity luncheons, and making sure everyone in her zip code knew exactly how wealthy she supposedly was. To Camilla, appearances were oxygen. If something did not look good to her wealthy friends, it simply did not exist. And then there was Preston, my older brother. At 31 years old, Preston was the undisputed golden child of the family. He was a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire life. Donovan and Camilla handed him a six-figure executive job at the logistics company the second he graduated college, despite the fact that he was breathtakingly incompetent. He possessed zero business sense, but he knew how to wear a custom suit and nod aggressively in board meetings. To make matters worse, Preston was married to Serena. My sister-in-law was a piece of work. She came from old money, or at least that is what she loudly claimed to anyone who would listen. Serena ran a quote-unquote luxury fashion brand that was nothing more than a glorified vanity project funded entirely by my father's business accounts. She was incredibly classist, deeply fake, and she absolutely loved finding subtle ways to remind me that I did not belong in their upper-crust world. They all looked down on me because 5 years ago, I committed the ultimate sin in their eyes. I dropped out of law school. What they conveniently loved to leave out of the story was exactly why I dropped out. I was 23, working 2 minimum wage jobs to afford my tuition, when I suffered a severe medical emergency. My appendix ruptured. I was rushed into emergency surgery and spent 2 weeks in the hospital fighting off a massive infection. I woke up drowning in tens of thousands of dollars in medical debt. I called my mother from my hospital bed, weeping, terrified, and in physical agony, begging for just a little bit of financial help to keep my head above water. Camilla sighed heavily into the phone, sounding completely annoyed that my life-threatening infection was interrupting her afternoon. She told me she was too busy packing for a luxury Mediterranean cruise with my father, and that as an adult, I needed to figure out my own problems without constantly draining her energy. That was the exact moment something inside me snapped. I realized my family would happily watch me drown if throwing me a life preserver ruined their manicure. I dropped out of law school, moved into a cheap, tiny apartment with terrible heating, and taught myself how to code. While recovering, I had noticed how incredibly inefficient the hospital's supply chain was. So, I spent the next 5 years working 18-hour days, completely isolating myself, to build an automated healthcare logistics software platform from scratch. It was grueling, brutal work. But I built it. And just 2 weeks ago, a massive tech conglomerate bought my software company out in pure cash. They wired exactly $52 million directly into my private accounts. I went from being the family failure to holding more liquid wealth than my father had ever seen in his entire life. But I did not tell them. I wanted to see exactly who they were when they thought I was still nothing. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh, blinding glow over the long mahogany dining table at my parents' sprawling estate. It was a Friday night, and we were supposed to be having a family dinner to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Donovan's logistics company. It was meant to be a night of legacy and pride. Instead, I was served up as the main course for their cruelty. I was sitting quietly near the end of the table, wearing a simple, clean dress I had bought off the rack a few years ago. Serena was swirling her expensive red wine, leaning back in her velvet chair with a deeply condescending smirk on her face. She looked me up and down, letting out a dramatic, pitying sigh. She told me that it was honestly embarrassing to have me sitting at the table in such cheap clothes, claiming I was literally bringing down the property value of the mansion just by breathing the air. She said that Preston and Donovan worked entirely too hard to build a respectable image in the community for me to ruin it by looking like a struggling fast food worker. I expected my mother to tell Serena to stop being so incredibly rude. Instead, Camilla smoothed the fabric of her designer evening gown, crossed her arms tightly, and vigorously agreed. Camilla looked at me with pure disgust and said I was a complete embarrassment. She told the table that she spent half her time at the country club making up elaborate lies about what I did for a living, just so her elite friends would not know her daughter was an uneducated failure. I felt the familiar sting in my chest, but I kept my mouth completely shut. Then, the real explosion happened. Donovan stood up. His heavy oak chair scraped violently against the expensive hardwood floor. His face was contorted with a rage that had been brewing since the moment I walked through the front door. He marched down the length of the table, grabbed the faded canvas duffel bag I had brought for the weekend, and walked straight toward the entryway. He opened the massive double doors and hurled my bag directly out onto the illuminated concrete driveway. The heavy thud echoed through the silent foyer. He pointed a shaking finger at me and unleashed his booming, authoritative pastoral voice. He yelled at me to get out. He called me a lowlife. He screamed that he would not have uneducated trash polluting his family celebration. He told me that I was a worthless parasite who had been nothing but a massive stain on his legacy since the day I selfishly dropped out of law school. His final words echoed off the marble walls, telling me to go out and beg in the streets, because I was entirely dead to this family. I looked slowly at the four of them. Donovan was red-faced and furious. Camilla looked completely unbothered, sipping her water. Preston was chuckling softly from his seat. And Serena was smiling like she had just won the lottery. They honestly believed they held all the emotional and financial power in the room. They thought they were kicking out a helpless girl with zero prospects. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not argue or scream or defend myself. I just looked my father dead in the eye, gave him a polite, completely dismissive smile, and said 2 words. Okay, fine. I turned on my heel and walked out the grand front doors. I stepped right past my discarded duffel bag sitting on the cold pavement. I left it there as a symbol of the helpless girl they thought I still was. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me with a resounding crack, locking me out of the family forever. But the polite, submissive daughter vanished the exact second I stepped past their iron gates. Waiting for me under the dim glow of a street lamp down the road was a sleek, black, bulletproof Maybach. My private driver stepped out immediately and opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather seat, enveloped by the quiet luxury of the vehicle. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed Lincoln. He was not just my lead corporate attorney. He was a ruthless financial fixer and the executive director of my private investment fund, Obsidian Capital. He answered on the very first ring. I stared out the tinted window as the Maybach glided smoothly onto the highway. The anger I had swallowed inside that dining room now fueled my next command. I told Lincoln to initiate the hostile takeover immediately. I ordered him to buy up every single piece of toxic debt my father and brother had accumulated over the years. I told him I wanted the transport company, I wanted the estate, I wanted absolutely everything. Lincoln replied without a moment of hesitation, telling me to consider it done. They thought they had just taken out the trash. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire kingdom directly to their absolute worst nightmare. Saturday morning arrived, and while my family was likely nursing their expensive wine hangovers, I was watching them blindly dig their own graves. The majestic glass walls of my father's logistics company hid a deeply rotting core, and my brother Preston was the one holding the shovel. Preston was sitting in the massive corner office that he had never earned, sweating through his custom-tailored suit. He was staring at the computer screen on his desk, clicking aggressively with his mouse. The company operating accounts were practically empty. There was a massive $2 million deficit flashing in bright red numbers across his financial dashboard. For the past year, Preston had been quietly siphoning funds from the corporate emergency reserves to prop up his wife's failing business. Serena loved to brag about her high-end luxury fashion brand, but the truth was incredibly pathetic. Her brand was a total scam. She was secretly importing extremely cheap, low-quality garments from overseas sweatshops, illegally replacing the tags with her own designer labels, and marking up the prices by 1,000%. But her overseas suppliers had caught on to her delayed payments and were actively threatening to expose her entire fraudulent operation to the press unless they were paid immediately. The glass door to Preston's office violently swung open, and Serena marched in without knocking. She slammed her heavy designer handbag onto his desk, practically vibrating with rage. She did not ask how he was doing. She immediately demanded to know why the latest wire transfer to her suppliers had bounced. Preston rubbed his temples, his voice shaking as he confessed the reality of their situation. He told her there was absolutely nothing left to transfer. He admitted he had already drained the company's emergency reserves, and if Donovan found out, the logistics empire would collapse and they would both be completely ruined. Serena did not offer a single ounce of sympathy for the husband who had just risked federal fraud for her. Instead, she weaponized her usual incredibly toxic tactics. She leaned over the desk, her eyes cold and calculating. She aggressively accused Preston of being a weak, pathetic excuse for a man who could not even provide for his own wife. She reminded him that she married into a wealthy legacy, and if he could not fund the lifestyle she was promised, she would easily find someone else who could. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at his face and told him to figure it out by the end of the day, or she would file for divorce and publicly humiliate him in front of their entire social circle. Then, she turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving the door wide open. Preston was hyperventilating. He was completely desperate. He knew he could never go to a traditional bank for a massive business loan. A real bank would require a full forensic audit of the company's books and, more importantly, it would require Donovan's direct physical authorization. The embezzlement would be discovered in 5 minutes. He needed quiet money. He needed a shadow lender who specialized in fast, aggressive loans and did not ask too many pesky questions about where the cash was going. Through his desperate, panicked networking with some shady contacts at the local country club, he caught wind of a highly exclusive private credit fund known for issuing massive loans with extreme discretion. The fund was called Obsidian Capital. He immediately requested an emergency meeting for that very afternoon, completely unaware that he was walking directly into the center of my web. I sat in the living room of my temporary downtown penthouse, sipping a hot cup of dark roast coffee. I had my laptop open on the kitchen island, watching a live, encrypted security feed from the Obsidian Capital boardroom. My lead attorney, Lincoln, was sitting at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. Lincoln was an absolute master of his craft. He was sharp, relentless, wearing an impeccable charcoal suit and entirely loyal to me. Preston was ushered into the boardroom looking completely frantic, but trying desperately to project the image of a calm, wealthy logistics heir. He puffed out his chest, adjusted his silk tie, and immediately started dropping our father's name, boasting endlessly about the mighty family legacy. He threw around wildly inflated revenue projections and promised that the loan he needed was just a temporary bridge for a minor warehouse expansion. Lincoln let him talk. He sat perfectly still, his expression completely unreadable, letting my brother exhaust himself with his own desperate lies. When Preston finally ran out of breath, Lincoln slid a thick stack of complex legal documents across the polished table. $5 million. It was the exact amount Preston had requested to cover his stolen funds and appease his furious wife. Preston's eyes lit up with sheer relief. He reached eagerly for the heavy silver pen on the table, but Lincoln placed a firm hand flat over the paperwork, stopping him dead in his tracks. Lincoln stated the terms of the agreement clearly and coldly. He explained that Obsidian Capital required absolute, undeniable security for a fast-tracked loan of this magnitude. He informed Preston that they would not accept the logistics company's trucking fleet or the outdated warehouses as collateral because the transport industry was entirely too volatile. Lincoln demanded something permanent. He demanded the deed to the family mansion and the primary holding corporation that owned the incredibly valuable real estate sitting directly underneath Donovan's megachurch. Preston froze. On the security feed, I literally watched the color completely drain from his face. He knew that putting the family estate and the sacred church land up as collateral was a massive, unforgivable betrayal. If he defaulted on this shadow loan, he would legally leave our parents homeless and destroy the very sanctuary our mother worshipped in. He started to stammer, sweating heavily, trying frantically to negotiate for different terms. He offered them a higher interest rate. He offered them personal guarantees. Lincoln did not argue. He simply pulled the thick stack of documents back toward his own side of the table. He looked at Preston with dead, shark-like eyes and told him the offer was strictly non-negotiable and that it would permanently expire the exact moment Preston walked out of the room. Lincoln reminded him that shadow funds do not wait for permission. Right at that critical moment, Preston's phone buzzed loudly on the mahogany table. It was a text message from Serena. Even through the security camera, I could see the panic in his posture as he read it. She was threatening to lock him out of their house and call her divorce lawyers by sunset if her boutique accounts were not fully funded. The suffocating pressure of maintaining his fake golden boy image completely shattered whatever tiny shred of loyalty he had left for our parents. Preston grabbed the silver pen. He did not read the incredibly dense fine print. He did not ask for his own lawyer to review the ruthless terms. He signed his own name rapidly on the very first line of the contract. Then his trembling hand hovered over the second line. The line that explicitly required the signature of the primary property owner. With shaking fingers, breathing heavily through his mouth, my brother perfectly forged our father Donovan's signature onto the dotted line. In a matter of 30 seconds, he had legally signed away the very roof over our parents' heads and the sacred ground they prayed on. Lincoln calmly collected the paperwork, meticulously checking the fresh signatures. He gave Preston a tight, highly professional smile and informed him that the $5 million would be wired to his corporate account within the hour. Preston let out a massive, pathetic sigh of relief. He stood up, smoothed his wrinkled jacket, and walked out of the boardroom feeling like an absolute genius who had just miraculously saved his own skin. He had absolutely no idea that the steel trap had just snapped completely shut around his ankles. The kingdom was legally mine. Sunday morning arrived, bringing a bitter, freezing chill to the city. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the massive automated systems at Obsidian Capital executed the first phase of the debt acquisition. Every single payroll account, emergency fund, and credit line tied to my father's logistics company was aggressively frozen by my banking algorithms. Over at the family estate, Donovan woke up to a nightmare. His phone was ringing off the hook with panicked calls from his chief financial officer. The company could not process a single transaction. They could not pay for the fuel to move their massive trucking fleet. By tomorrow morning, the entire transport business would grind to a devastating halt. Donovan was in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. He needed an emergency cash injection of at least $3 million to unfreeze the logistics accounts before the market opened on Monday. Through his corrupt network of high society church elders, Donovan heard a massive piece of local real estate gossip. Word on the street was that an incredibly wealthy, anonymous tech billionaire had just purchased the most expensive, ultra-luxury estate in the neighboring elite zip code, paying $15 million in pure cash. Driven by blinding desperation and his trademark massive ego, Donovan formulated a plan. He convinced himself that he could easily charm this new anonymous billionaire into a highly lucrative partnership. He put on his finest tailored Sunday suit. He even drove to a high-end boutique and put an incredibly expensive vintage watch on a credit card he did not know was about to decline, intending to use it as a lavish introductory gift. He drove his luxury sedan directly to the sprawling $15 million mansion, preparing to pitch the deal of a lifetime to a stranger. I was standing in the grand, sweeping foyer of my new home, reviewing some architectural plans with my design team, when the heavy brass doorbell chimed. I signaled to my security chief, Vaughn, a massive, incredibly imposing man who moved with lethal precision. Vaughn smoothly opened the towering double doors. Donovan stood on my grand front porch, holding his pathetic gift bag, putting on his most charismatic, blinding pastoral smile. He looked past Vaughn's massive shoulders and his eyes landed directly on me. I was wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored white silk outfit, holding a tablet in my hands. The smile on my father's face completely froze, slowly melting into a look of absolute, profound confusion. His brain simply could not process the reality in front of him. To him, I was still the uneducated trash he had thrown onto the concrete just 3 days ago. He narrowed his eyes, his confusion quickly shifting into aggressive arrogance. He looked me up and down and scoffed loudly. He demanded to know what on earth I was doing in a place like this. He actually asked me if I had taken his advice and found a job scrubbing floors for the wealthy. He told me to stop standing around looking stupid and go fetch the actual owner of the property immediately because he had incredibly urgent business to discuss. I did not move a single inch. I just stared at him with complete, chilling indifference. Vaughn stepped forward, placing his massive frame slightly between me and my father. He looked down at Donovan with absolute utter disdain. Vaughn spoke in a deep, booming voice that echoed off the high ceilings of the porch. He informed my father that he was speaking directly to the owner of the estate. He explicitly referred to me as Madam CEO and firmly ordered Donovan to step back from the threshold. I watched the devastating reality hit my father like a speeding freight train. His eyes darted wildly around the massive, opulent foyer, taking in the towering crystal chandeliers and the imported marble floors, before snapping back to my completely calm face. The staggering realization that the daughter he discarded was the anonymous tech billionaire sent him into a rapid, terrifying spiral. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. Instead of apologizing or acting with an ounce of humility, his toxic entitlement exploded. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at me. He screamed that I was holding out on my own family. He demanded that I write him a check for $3 million right this very second to save his company, claiming that as my father, he was legally and morally entitled to a massive share of my hidden wealth. He actually tried to order me to hand over my money. I stepped slightly around Vaughn, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away from his sweating, panicked face. I looked directly into his wide, desperate eyes, and I let a slow, wicked smile spread across my face. I told him I would not give him a single dime if he was dying of thirst. I reminded him that I was just a worthless parasite who belonged in the streets. I told him to take his cheap watch and get off my property before I had him arrested for trespassing. Before he could scream another hateful word, I grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the massive $15 million door directly in his face. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The war had officially begun. If you're feeling a sense of satisfaction watching hypocrites get slapped in the face by reality, please like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part, and don't forget to leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you so much. By Monday morning, the complete financial hemorrhage caused by Preston's massive shadow loan and my aggressive account freezes had finally trickled down to my mother's daily allowances. Camilla was a woman who practically demanded preferential treatment everywhere she went. But suddenly, her platinum credit cards were being brutally declined at her favorite high-end boutiques and luxury spas. Donovan had lied to her, telling her there was just a minor clerical error at the bank that would be sorted out shortly. But my mother was not completely stupid when it came to preserving her own skin. She knew the family cash flow was violently drying up. She needed massive amounts of liquid cash immediately to maintain her weekly country club lunches and her incredibly fake charity donations. She could never, ever let the other wealthy wives suspect that the prestigious transport family was struggling to pay for basic luxuries. The gossip alone would physically destroy her. So, she quietly packed up the absolute most prized possession she owned, the vintage, flawless diamond heirloom necklace and matching chandelier earrings that had been in our family for 4 generations. The pieces were a symbol of our lineage, and she used to parade them around at galas as undeniable physical proof of our elite status. Camilla slipped out of the mansion on Monday morning, wearing an oversized designer hat and dark sunglasses to hide her face. She drove her Mercedes directly to the most exclusive private jeweler in the incredibly wealthy district of Buckhead. This was a discreet, highly secure underground vault where old money families went to quietly liquidate their assets without making the evening news. She walked into the pristine marble lobby, demanding to see the head appraiser immediately, absolutely refusing to speak to the junior staff. She placed the heavy velvet box on the glass counter and began spinning a thinly veiled lie, claiming she simply wanted to temporarily loan the pieces to the vault for safekeeping while they traveled internationally. She spoke with her usual arrogant, commanding tone, demanding a premium valuation based entirely on her family name. She was completely unaware that I had a scheduled private viewing at that exact same jeweler. I had been sitting inside the velvet-lined VIP suite, sipping sparkling water while the staff showed me their most exclusive inventory. I stepped out of the private viewing room wearing a tailored white silk suit that cost more than her entire seasonal wardrobe combined. I paused when I saw her standing by the main counter. We made eye contact, and the temperature in the elegant showroom dropped below freezing. My mother lowered her sunglasses slowly. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her usual toxic mask of superiority snapped right back into place. To her, I was still the uneducated failure. She looked me up and down and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She asked me what on earth I was doing in a place like this, loudly asking if I was there to clean the display cases, because I was severely underdressed for a janitorial job. I did not react to her venom. I simply walked gracefully toward the counter, standing right next to her. At that exact moment, the head appraiser walked back out from the secure vault. He cleared his throat apologetically. He looked at my mother and told her that given the current saturated market conditions, the absolute maximum loan they could offer for the diamond set was $200,000. My mother looked like she had just been physically struck across the jaw. She argued frantically, her voice rising in panic. She claimed the pieces were worth at least $500,000. She demanded that he reconsider, aggressively reminding him of her social standing and her husband's business empire. The appraiser remained strictly professional, stating that $200,000 was their final offer for a collateral pawn, and they could not extend the limit simply based on a family name. Camilla was suffocating with desperation. She needed the money to fund a massive charity gala she was hosting. She took a deep, shaking breath and reached for the pen to sign the humiliating pawn agreement. She was literally selling our family history to buy fake smiles from people who did not even care if she lived or died. I stepped forward before the pen could touch the paper. I looked directly at the appraiser. I told him I would buy the set outright. My voice cut clearly through the quiet room. I announced that I would pay the full $500,000 valuation in pure cash right now. My mother froze, completely paralyzed. She turned her head slowly to look at me, letting out a desperate, mocking sneer. She told me to stop embarrassing myself, claiming I did not have $500 to my name, let alone $500,000. She ordered me to get out before she had security throw me onto the street. I did not say a single word. I simply opened my small clutch and pulled out my solid black American Express Centurion card. I placed it gently onto the glass counter, right next to her trembling hand. The heavy metal card made a soft, incredibly powerful clinking sound. The appraiser immediately recognized the invitation-only card. His entire demeanor shifted to deep, absolute respect. He took the card without a second of hesitation and began processing the massive transaction. My mother completely stopped breathing. Her eyes were violently locked onto the black metal card sitting on the terminal. She watched in absolute, horrified silence as the machine approved a $500,000 purchase in less than 5 seconds. The appraiser handed me the receipt to sign and carefully placed the diamond heirlooms into a secure travel case. He handed the elegant bag to me and bowed his head slightly. The arrogant smirk had completely vanished from Camilla's face, leaving behind a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. Her reality was fracturing in real time. I picked up the secure bag containing the diamonds, turned to face her, and gave her the exact same condescending smile she had given me my entire life. "Thanks for holding on to my stuff, Mom," I said, my voice soft but deadly. I walked out of the jeweler, leaving her standing there entirely frozen as the heavy glass doors closed behind me. While Camilla was losing her mind at the jeweler, my sister-in-law Serena was busy putting on a spectacular performance at the Piedmont Driving Club. Serena had rented out the most exclusive private terrace overlooking the 18th hole just to host an extravagant afternoon tea party for her circle of wealthy, superficial friends. These were women who measured a person's absolute worth entirely by their zip code and the designer labels draped across their shoulders. Serena absolutely thrived in this toxic environment. Silver-tiered trays loaded with imported caviar, delicate French pastries, and rare artisan teas covered the long white table. Bottles of incredibly expensive vintage champagne were being popped open by the attentive staff every 15 minutes to keep the crystal flutes completely full. Serena laughed loudly, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder while she bragged endlessly to her friends about a fabricated upcoming trip to Paris. She painted a flawless picture of absolute financial dominance, completely ignoring the bitter reality that her husband had just secretly mortgaged his parents' entire estate to keep her fraudulent vanity project afloat. The afternoon dragged on in a blur of hollow compliments and subtle boasting. Finally, Serena signaled the head waiter with a dismissive, arrogant flick of her wrist, ready to wrap up her extravagant display of fake wealth. The waiter approached quietly and placed the black leather-bound checkbook gently on the table. The total came out to just over $10,000 for a few hours of finger sandwiches and champagne. Serena did not even bother looking at the itemized receipt. She smoothly pulled the heavy metal corporate card belonging to my father's logistics company from her purse and tossed it carelessly onto the silver tray. She went right back to telling a long-winded story, waving her hand as the waiter walked away. In her mind, the logistics company was a bottomless piggy bank. She expected the waiter to return quickly with a polite smile, thanking her for her generous patronage. Instead, he returned 5 minutes later, looking incredibly nervous. He stood slightly behind her chair, leaning down and whispering softly, trying to preserve her dignity in front of her high society guests. He politely informed her that the terminal had aggressively rejected the transaction and asked if she perhaps had another form of payment. Serena stopped talking mid-sentence. The polite fake smile vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a deep, indignant scowl. She looked at the waiter as if he were a disgusting insect. She raised her voice intentionally, making sure all her wealthy friends could hear the exchange. She told him his machine must be broken because she was handing him an elite corporate account with a limitless balance. She violently snatched her purse, pulled out a second card tied to a different business account, and threw it onto the tray, telling him to try again and to stop wasting her valuable time. The waiter rushed away, his face bright red. But less than 3 minutes later, the general manager of the club approached the table personally. His face was pale and his posture was completely stiff. He did not bother whispering this time. He placed both metal cards firmly on the table and stated clearly, in front of everyone, that every single card tied to her name and her husband's corporate accounts had been completely declined by the issuer. He requested that she provide a personal credit card or wire the funds directly to settle the $10,000 bill immediately. The entire table fell dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped completely. Serena's friends stared at her, their eyes wide with shock and quiet, brutal judgment. It was public financial humiliation, the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to a woman in her fragile social position. Serena completely lost her mind. She stood up aggressively, knocking her heavy chair backward against the stone patio. She began screaming at the manager, demanding his full name and threatening to have him fired before sunset. She snatched her phone from the table and declared she was calling her elite banking concierge right this second to prove how utterly incompetent the club staff were. She put the phone on speaker volume, turned it all the way up, and slammed it onto the center of the table so her friends could hear her incoming vindication. The phone rang twice before the private bank manager answered. Serena launched into a furious tirade, demanding to know why her corporate cards were being declined at a prestigious country club. There was a long, incredibly heavy pause on the other end of the line. The bank manager cleared his throat, sounding genuinely terrified. He told Serena there was no glitch. He explained that a massive legal directive had come through from a superior financial institution. Every single account tied to her husband and the entire logistics company had been completely frozen. The assets were locked down tight under a hostile debt acquisition order. Serena's face drained of all color. Her friends were whispering furiously among themselves. Serena grabbed the phone, her voice trembling with fear and pure rage. She ordered the bank manager to give her the name of the new lien holder who dared to authorize such a massive asset freeze. The speakerphone crackled slightly in the quiet breeze of the patio. The bank manager read the legal documentation out loud. He stated that the immediate asset freeze was executed manually by the sole owner of Obsidian Capital. Serena screamed at him to read the name on the signature line. The manager took a breath and read the name slowly and clearly. He told her the authorizing signature read, Kendra. The phone slipped out of Serena's hand and crashed heavily onto the table. Her knees buckled slightly as the uneducated trash they had thrown out of the house just tightened the leash around her throat in front of the entire city. Tuesday evening arrived, bringing with it the most anticipated high society event of the entire year, the Atlanta Heritage Charity Gala. It was a massive ballroom filled with old money politicians, venture capitalists, and the absolute peak of the social calendar. My father, Donovan, had been banking his entire survival on this exact night. He was completely desperate to court new billionaire investors and secure a massive cash injection to save his rapidly sinking logistics empire. He stood near the center of the ballroom wearing a velvet tuxedo, smiling and aggressively shaking hands, completely unaware that his company was already entirely mine. Beside him stood my mother, Camilla. She was dripping in what appeared to be her famous family diamonds. Only she and I knew they were flawless cubic zirconia replicas she had rush-ordered online after I bought the real heirlooms right out from under her. She smiled tightly at the cameras, but her eyes started nervously around the room. And then there was Serena. My sister-in-law looked absolutely sick. She was wearing a designer dress, but her face was pale and her hands violently shook as she gripped a glass of dark red wine. She had spent the last 24 hours living in pure terror after discovering that I was the phantom debt holder who had humiliated her at the country club. She had not told Preston the truth yet. She was too cowardly to admit what was happening. The grand double doors of the ballroom suddenly opened. The low hum of classical music was entirely drowned out by a sudden wave of intense, echoing whispers. I stepped into the blinding light. I did not arrive in cheap clothes or carrying a faded duffel bag. I arrived wearing a breathtaking, custom emerald green haute couture gown that swept the floor with heavy layers of imported silk. A delicate diamond choker rested on my collarbone, perfectly complementing the absolute confidence radiating from my posture. My private security detail waited discreetly in the hall while I walked slowly down the grand staircase. Every single camera flashed. Every eye in the room turned toward me. My family stared in utter, paralyzing disbelief. Donovan's polite smile instantly morphed into a mask of pure rage. He could not comprehend how the daughter he had publicly banished was walking into a $50,000-a-plate charity dinner looking like absolute royalty. Serena watched me glide gracefully across the room, and something inside her fragile, toxic brain completely snapped. The humiliation of her declined credit cards and the sheer terror of my financial power boiled over into irrational venom. She needed to tear me down and publicly humiliate me to regain some twisted sense of control. Serena marched toward me, holding her crystal glass of red wine tightly. As she closed the distance, she feigned a sudden, dramatic stumble. She lunged forward intentionally, thrusting her arm out and splashing the dark red vintage wine directly onto the bodice of my incredibly expensive emerald silk gown. The dark liquid splattered across the fabric, leaving a massive, ugly stain right down the front of my dress. Several guests gasped out loud, covering their mouths in shock. Serena immediately threw herself backward, pretending to lose her balance. She let out a loud, highly theatrical cry, putting her hands up defensively. She wailed, making sure her voice carried to the surrounding tables, asking me not to be so aggressive, claiming I pushed her because I was angry I did not belong there. She played the fragile victim perfectly. Camilla rushed over immediately, placing a protective arm around Serena and glaring at me with absolute disgust. Camilla loudly declared that my presence was an insult to the charity and that I was nothing but a violent brute. They waited for me to break. They expected me to cry or run out of the ballroom in shame. I looked down at the dark wine soaking into my dress. I did not flinch. I did not reach for a napkin. I simply looked back up at Serena and gave her a slow, terrifying smile. At that exact moment, the ballroom lights dimmed dramatically, and a bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. The chairman of the charity organization stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone. The room quieted down. He announced that tonight, they had reached a historic milestone for the Children's Hospital. He told the massive crowd that a single anonymous donor had fully funded the new pediatric wing with an unprecedented cash gift of exactly $10 million. Donovan puffed out his chest, leaning forward and whispering to Preston that they needed to corner this mysterious billionaire before the night was over to pitch their logistics company. The chairman smiled warmly. He announced that the anonymous donor had graciously agreed to say a few words to the guests tonight. He gestured toward the center of the room, looking directly at me, and called my name. He asked Kendra, the executive director of Obsidian Capital, to please come to the stage. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. It was deafening. Donovan completely stopped breathing. Preston's jaw dropped so hard it nearly unhinged. Camilla stumbled backward as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. Serena let out a small, pathetic gasp, her eyes darting frantically for an exit. I stepped away from them, completely ignoring the dark wine stain ruining my gown. I walked toward the stage with the grace of a conquering queen. I climbed the steps, stood behind the polished podium, and looked out over the sea of wealthy elites. My gaze landed directly on my family, standing frozen in the middle of the room. I adjusted the microphone and let my voice fill the massive ballroom. I thanked the chairman, and then I stated that true wealth is not defined by stolen assets or fraudulent shadow loans. I looked dead into my father's eyes. I announced to the entire room of billionaires and investors that Obsidian Capital had recently acquired the toxic debt of several failing local businesses. I stated clearly and loudly that my fund had just initiated a total hostile takeover of Donovan's logistics company due to gross mismanagement, severe embezzlement, and imminent bankruptcy. The whispers erupted into a chaotic, deafening roar. Venture capitalists and bank executives immediately pulled out their phones to cancel any pending deals with my father. I effectively and completely destroyed my father's business reputation in less than 3 minutes, standing there in my ruined dress. Donovan clutched his chest, gasping heavily for air as his entire world collapsed around him. Preston looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the expensive carpet. Serena tried to hide her face, but there was nowhere left to run. I stood at the podium victorious, knowing the real purge was only just beginning. The morning after the charity gala, the logistics company headquarters was a scene of absolute, unrestrained chaos. Employees were frantically packing up their desks into cardboard boxes and whispering nervously about the massive scandal that had just exploded the night before. The news of my hostile takeover had already hit the local financial blogs, and phones were ringing off the hook, but nobody was answering them. The entire corporate structure was collapsing in real time. Preston sat inside his glass-enclosed corner office, staring blankly at his blinking phone. The grace period for the $5 million shadow loan was officially over, and the crushing reality of his situation was finally suffocating him. The heavy glass door to his office pushed open. Preston jumped out of his expensive leather chair, expecting to see building security coming to escort him out. Instead, my lead attorney walked in. Lincoln looked impeccable in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a single, incredibly slim leather folder under his arm. He did not knock, and he did not offer a polite greeting. He simply walked over to the large mahogany desk and looked at my brother with a mixture of pity and absolute boredom. Preston immediately launched into a frantic, desperate pitch, begging for a 30-day extension, promising exclusive shipping contracts for the next decade. Lincoln simply stated that Obsidian Capital was not a charity, and they did not grant extensions to men who forged their father's signatures to secure fraudulent loans. He informed Preston that the physical locks on the building would be changed by noon. Before Preston could fall to his knees, the office door flew open again. Serena burst into the room wearing oversized dark sunglasses and clutching her designer handbag. She had rushed over the moment she heard the takeover was actually happening. When she saw Lincoln standing there, her entire demeanor violently shifted. She completely ignored her panicked husband and zeroed in on the man she thought held the power. She assumed Lincoln was just another greedy corporate suit who could be easily swayed by a beautiful woman offering a private favor. Serena walked slowly toward Lincoln, letting her sunglasses slide down her nose to reveal her big, pleading eyes. She put on a sickly sweet smile and lowered her voice to a soft purr. She stepped uncomfortably close to him, leaning over the desk and deliberately brushing her hand against his tailored sleeve. She whispered that if he could just accidentally lose the foreclosure paperwork for a few weeks, she would make sure he was personally and deeply compensated. Lincoln looked down at her hand resting on his arm as if it were a dead insect. He took a deliberate step back. The office blinds were wide open, and dozens of employees were staring through the glass walls, watching the boss's wife throw herself at the man shutting down their company. Lincoln raised his voice just enough so the people standing outside the door could hear every single word. He asked Serena if she was seriously attempting to offer a physical bribe to a corporate attorney in a glass office while her husband's company went bankrupt. He advised her to keep her hands to herself before he added attempted bribery to the long list of criminal charges currently pending against her. The remaining staff in the bullpen actually gasped out loud. Serena recoiled, her face burning bright red as the sheer humiliation washed over her. Preston finally found his voice, puffing out his chest and demanding to know what criminal charges Lincoln was talking about. He insisted that he had used every single dollar of that $5 million to try and keep the logistics company afloat. Lincoln did not argue. He simply unclasped the slim leather folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and let it flutter down onto the center of the desk. It was a highly detailed offshore banking statement. Lincoln coldly explained that our forensic accountants track every single digital footprint across the globe. He pointed to a specific highlighted line. The statement showed a direct wire transfer executed less than 2 hours after the shadow loan hit the logistics account. It was a transfer for exactly $2 million, routed directly to a private shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. Lincoln looked right into Preston's terrified eyes and informed him that the Cayman account was directly tied to Serena's failing vanity brand. Routing secured corporate loan funds into a hidden offshore personal account was textbook federal fraud, and Serena was the primary beneficiary. Preston looked from the paper to his wife, realizing the absolute magnitude of the crime. She had completely played him. Lincoln picked up his folder and told them they had exactly 30 minutes to clear out before he called the federal authorities. The drive back to the sprawling family estate was a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Preston violently hitting the steering wheel. As soon as his expensive car slammed into park in the circular driveway, Preston stormed through the grand double doors of the mansion. Serena was right on his heels, but the terrified wife routine had completely vanished. She walked into the foyer with her arms crossed and a deeply calculated expression on her face. Preston turned around and cornered her in the center of the massive living room. His voice shook with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. He screamed that she had intentionally manipulated him into securing the shadow loan just so she could siphon $2 million directly into her own personal safety net. He paced back and forth, pulling at his hair, asking how she could possibly betray him when he had just risked federal prison for her. Serena did not shed a single tear. She dropped her designer bag onto the pristine white sofa and let out a cold, dismissive laugh. She looked at her husband as if he were nothing more than a pathetic bug on the floor. She told Preston to stop acting like a victim, openly admitting that the offshore account had been active for over a year. She had been quietly filtering funds out of his logistics company long before I ever initiated the hostile takeover. She called him a weak, incompetent fool who was so desperate to feel like a powerful CEO that he practically handed her the company bank codes on a silver platter. Preston was hyperventilating. He lunged toward her, demanding that she transfer the $2 million back into the logistics account right this second, begging her to fix this so Lincoln would call off the federal investigation. Serena took a step back and gave him a look of pure venom. She stated that she would not be transferring a single dime because that money was her severance package for wasting years of her life playing the supportive wife. Preston threatened to call the police himself and drag her down with him. Serena did not flinch. She leaned in close and smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. She mockingly reminded him about the loan documents sitting in Lincoln's briefcase. She asked Preston exactly who forged his father's signature on the collateral agreement. Serena explicitly stated that if he even thought about touching her money, she would walk straight into the police precinct and personally hand over the evidence of his forgery, ensuring he would be the only one wearing handcuffs by sunset. They viciously tore each other apart in the middle of that lavish living room, completely unaware that they were not the only ones listening to this explosive confession. Across town at the prestigious megachurch, my mother, Camilla, was sitting at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. It was the monthly meeting of the elite charity committee. She had spent the entire morning desperately trying to maintain her flawless facade after the absolute disaster of the gala the night before. She sat surrounded by the wealthiest wives in Atlanta, acting as if the rumors of her husband's bankruptcy were nothing but jealous whispers. Behind my mother, the massive high-definition projection screens usually reserved for church presentations hung silently on the wall. She had absolutely no idea that my tech team had spent the last 48 hours quietly hacking into the mansion's internal smart home system. Every security camera and every microphone in my parents' living room was fully under my control. Right as Camilla raised her coffee cup to propose a new fundraising drive, the massive screens behind her suddenly flickered to life. The soft church music playing in the background was instantly cut off, replaced by the deafening, high-quality audio of Serena screaming at Preston. The elite committee members froze, dropping their pens and staring at the screens in pure shock. The live feed displayed Preston and Serena standing in the family living room, tearing each other to pieces. Camilla's coffee cup shattered against the mahogany table. The crystal-clear audio echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings as the entire committee watched Serena mock Preston for being a failure. They listened in horror as Preston screamed about the stolen $2 million. And then the final devastating blow echoed through the speakers. Serena explicitly yelled that Preston had forged Donovan's signature to secure a shadow loan, and that he had completely lost the family mansion and the very church land they were currently sitting on. Camilla could not breathe. She turned around slowly, her face completely drained of blood. The other wealthy wives began whispering frantically, backing away from the table as if my mother were suddenly contagious. The flawless facade she had spent her entire life building was completely incinerated in front of the exact people she wanted to impress the most. The fallout from the live broadcast at the church committee meeting was catastrophic. As the wealthy wives fled the room in horror, whispering frantically into their cell phones, my father was summoned to face the absolute wreckage of his legacy. He burst into the megachurch administrative wing, his face a mask of pure panic. Preston had been dragged into the pastoral suite, looking like a cornered rat. I watched the entire exchange through the internal security cameras my tech team had compromised. I expected Donovan to finally unleash his righteous anger and punish his golden boy for forging his signature and destroying the family logistics empire. Instead, Donovan slammed the heavy oak door shut and completely ignored the ethics or the law. He only cared about saving his own face. He grabbed Preston by the collar and demanded to know exactly how much cash was needed to pay off Obsidian Capital and buy back the seized collateral before the banks went public. Preston, shaking uncontrollably, admitted that the logistics accounts were completely frozen and Serena's offshore stash was locked down. He told our father they needed at least $4.5 million in liquid cash before sunset, or the foreclosure would hit the evening news. Donovan released his son and began pacing the length of his lavish pastoral office. He looked at the massive gold cross hanging on the wall and then made a decision so utterly repulsive it proved exactly why I needed to destroy him. He calmly walked over to his mahogany desk and booted up his private computer terminal. He told Preston to wipe his face because he had a solution. Donovan explained that the church had just concluded a massive 3-year fundraising drive for the Global Orphan Outreach Program. There was exactly $4.5 million sitting in a high-yield charity account waiting to be distributed to vulnerable children overseas. Donovan held the sole executive authorization over those funds. He justified the theft instantly, telling his son that God would understand they needed to borrow the money to protect the church's leadership from a public scandal. He planned to drain the orphan fund completely, wire the money to a dummy corporation, and use it to buy out the toxic debt I was holding over their heads. He was willing to steal from desperate, helpless children just to cover up his son's criminal incompetence. He sat down in his high-backed leather chair and quickly pulled up the secure banking portal. His hands were trembling with adrenaline as he typed in his pastoral credentials, preparing to execute the massive wire transfer. He actually smiled a sick, triumphant smile, believing he was untouchable behind the sacred walls of his megachurch. He had absolutely no idea that I was already walking down the carpeted hallway right toward his private sanctuary. The church security guards had not even tried to stop me because my legal team had already served them with the preliminary injunctions proving that the physical church property now legally belonged to my firm. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to the pastoral office without knocking. Vaughn, my massive head of security, stepped in right behind me. Donovan and Preston jumped out of their seats. Donovan slammed his laptop shut, demanding to know how I got into his private office, ordering me to leave the holy grounds immediately. He swore that he was about to fix everything Preston had broken and that my pathetic attempt to ruin them had completely failed. I did not raise my voice. I walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug, reached into my leather tote bag, and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier stamped with official government seals. I tossed the heavy stack of documents directly onto his pristine desk, letting the papers slide across the polished wood and knock over his expensive pen set. I looked my father dead in the eye and let a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. I told him he was right about one thing. He was about to initiate a wire transfer. But I told him to open the laptop and check the account balance before he made any more promises he could not keep. I leaned forward and stated clearly that he would not be getting a single dime. I informed him that my forensic accountants had audited the church financials during the corporate takeover and flagged his highly suspicious account activities. I watched the blood drain from his face as I told him I had anonymously contacted the Federal Charity Commission weeks ago. The exact moment he attempted to log into the secure banking portal to drain the Global Orphan Fund, he triggered a massive silent alarm that locked the entire system down. The money was fully under federal oversight. He was entirely trapped. Thursday afternoon brought the absolute final deadline for my parents to vacate the premises and surrender the massive estate to my liquidators. I pulled my sleek black sedan into the long circular driveway, parking right behind the massive moving trucks my firm had generously provided. The perfectly manicured front lawn was crawling with my private security contractors, standing like stone statues along the perimeter. I walked through the massive double doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The luxurious mansion looked completely stripped and terrifyingly hollow. All the custom furniture and expensive imported rugs had already been seized and catalogued. I walked up the sweeping staircase and found Serena in the master suite, tearing through her massive walk-in closet like a frantic, trapped animal. She was aggressively stuffing diamond jewelry and luxury watches into a leather duffel bag, trying to salvage whatever liquid assets she could carry before the banks froze the physical property. She froze when she saw me standing in the doorway. Her perfectly manicured face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She demanded to know what I was doing in her house. I leaned against the doorframe and calmly informed her that this was no longer her house and that my team was currently downstairs cataloging the imported furniture for immediate auction. Serena was backed into a tight corner, and she knew it. But instead of accepting defeat, she decided to use the most dangerous weapon she had left in her arsenal. She backed away from me, grabbed her cell phone from the marble nightstand, stared at me with cold malice, and dialed 911. The moment the emergency dispatcher answered, Serena's entire demeanor changed instantly. Her voice began to tremble and break as she forced herself into a state of sheer, manufactured panic. She started sobbing hysterically into the phone, claiming that there was an aggressive black woman trespassing in her home and threatening her life. She paced around the bedroom, weeping and gasping for air, putting on the performance of a lifetime. She told the dispatcher that I was violent and unstable, and she begged the police to hurry, playing the fragile, terrified victim in hopes that the armed authorities would arrive and immediately escalate the situation against me. I did not move a single muscle. I simply waited in complete silence. Serena hung up the phone, wiped her eyes, and smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. She told me I was going to spend the next 10 years in a prison cell for home invasion. Within 10 minutes, the deafening sound of police sirens echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed through the large bedroom windows as multiple squad cars slammed into park on the front driveway. Heavy footsteps pounded up the main marble staircase. Serena immediately threw herself onto the floor and began weeping loudly, perfectly timing her distress for the arriving officers. 3 police officers burst into the master suite. Serena scrambled toward them, pointing a shaking finger directly at me, wailing that I had broken into her house and threatened to kill her. I calmly reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my corporate identification alongside the highly detailed legal property deed, confirming my absolute ownership of the estate. The lead officer, a tall captain with a stern expression, took the documents and reviewed them quickly. He handed them back to me with a polite nod. He did not ask me to put my hands behind my back. He did not draw his weapon. He simply walked right past me. Serena stopped crying, completely confused as the captain approached her instead. He grabbed her arm, firmly pulled her up from the floor, and twisted her wrist behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the quiet bedroom. Serena began screaming and thrashing, demanding to know what they were doing. The captain stared at her with absolute authority and stated clearly that she was under arrest for wire fraud and international money laundering under federal FBI orders. Serena let out a piercing shriek that sounded like a wild animal caught in a trap. She thrashed against the heavy grip of the police officers, but they marched her forcefully out of the lavish master suite. Down in the foyer, Donovan had just emerged from his study. The sight of the police hauling his daughter-in-law away, combined with the presence of my liquidation team, completely broke whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left. His face turned a dangerous, violent shade of purple. He let out a guttural roar, pointing a shaking finger at me as I walked down the stairs. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. He raised a heavy clenched fist high into the air, aiming a violent, desperate strike directly at my face. I did not flinch. Before Donovan could even bring his fist down, Vaughn moved with lethal professional precision. My head of security stepped smoothly into the path of the strike, grabbed my father's arm mid-swing, twisted his wrist, and drove a heavy shoulder directly into his chest. Donovan let out a loud wheeze as his feet completely left the ground. Vaughn tackled him hard, driving the disgraced pastor face-first into the concrete driveway with a sickening thud. Vaughn pressed his knee heavily into my father's back and calmly secured his hands with a pair of heavy plastic zip ties. The police officers outside immediately rushed over, officially arresting my father for assault and trespassing on my corporate property. The Great Purge was reaching its final, beautiful crescendo. The flashing police lights continued to illuminate the circular driveway as another luxury vehicle came skidding dangerously through the open wrought iron gates. It was my mother, Camilla. She had practically flown her car away from the megachurch after the disastrous live broadcast, completely abandoning her elite charity committee members in a frantic rush to find her precious son. She stumbled blindly out of her vehicle, ignoring the departing police cruisers, and ran straight into the mansion. Camilla burst into the massive foyer and immediately saw Preston kneeling on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, weeping loudly like a helpless, terrified child. She threw herself onto the carpet next to him, wrapping her arms fiercely and protectively around his shaking shoulders, whispering repeatedly that she would fix this disaster. Then she looked up and saw me standing calmly at the top of the marble staircase. Her face instantly contorted into a mask of pure, irrational hatred. She unleashed a barrage of vicious, screaming insults, blaming me entirely for every single disaster that had befallen our prestigious family. She yelled that Preston was a good, honest man who had simply made a few naive business mistakes, and that I was an evil monster obsessively dedicated to destroying my own brother. She declared fiercely that God would eternally punish me for stealing the family home right out from under them. I slowly walked down the grand marble staircase, my footsteps echoing clearly over the sound of Preston's pathetic sobbing. I did not yell back or defend myself against her toxic delusions. I told my mother that her perfect golden boy was not just a terrible, incompetent businessman who forged signatures. I told her that Preston was a desperate, dangerous coward who was willing to do absolutely anything to silence the sister who finally caught him. Camilla sneered at me harshly, demanding to know what malicious, fabricated lies I was spinning now. I did not need her to believe my words. I only needed her to believe his. I reached into the pocket of my emerald suit and pulled out my cell phone, navigating smoothly to a secure audio file my private investigators had intercepted just 48 hours ago. Preston had been so panicked about the impending corporate audit that he blindly reached out to a shadowy criminal contact he had met through one of Serena's fake offshore vendors. I turned the volume on my phone all the way up and pressed play, holding the device out so my mother could hear every single syllable clearly. The crystal-clear audio filled the silent grand foyer. It was Preston's voice, frantic, desperate, and trembling with fear. He was speaking to an unknown man, demanding to know exactly how much cash it would cost to make a massive problem permanently disappear. The deep voice on the recording asked Preston who the specific target was. Preston's voice echoed loudly off the marble walls, explicitly stating my full first and last name. He eagerly promised to pay $200,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency if the man could successfully orchestrate a fatal car accident before the end of the week. He literally begged the man on the phone to kill his own sister. The recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating dead silence hanging in the massive room. Camilla stopped rocking him. Her entire body went completely rigid and cold. She slowly loosened her protective grip on her golden boy. She looked down at Preston, who had buried his face deeply in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably because he knew there was absolutely no way to lie his way out of this damning evidence. The horrifying reality of what she had just heard crashed down on her. The boy she had relentlessly protected and elevated above me at every single turn had actively tried to hire a hitman to brutally murder her own daughter. Camilla let out a quiet, horrified gasp. She pushed herself violently backward, crawling away from Preston as if he were suddenly covered in a deadly infectious disease. Her eyes were wide with a paralyzing terror. She looked up at me, the arrogance completely stripped from her bones. She scrambled forward on her knees, the elite socialite reduced to a weeping, pathetic mess. She begged me to show her mercy, claiming that she had lost absolutely everything. She wailed that Donovan was facing prison, Preston was a monster, and the banks had seized all her credit cards. She looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks and begged me to let her stay in the house, swearing she could not survive out there in the real world among regular, struggling people. She tried to manipulate my emotions using the exact same toxic tactics she always had. She reminded me that she carried me in her womb and gave me life, insisting that a daughter owes her mother a basic level of care and respect. I looked at the woman kneeling on my floor, and I kept my voice completely devoid of any warmth. I told Camilla that her sudden desperate plea for family loyalty was incredibly ironic considering how she had treated me 5 years ago. I reminded her of the night I was rushed to the emergency room, drowning in massive medical debt, begging my own mother for a tiny fraction of the financial help she freely threw at Preston. I repeated the exact cruel words she had spat at me while I was lying in that sterile hospital bed, fighting for my life. She had told me she was busy preparing for a luxury cruise and could not be bothered with my endless dramatic problems. I reached into my bag and pulled out a cheap, glossy pamphlet. I tossed it carelessly across the polished marble, letting it slide right to her trembling hands. Camilla looked down at the cover, and her face went entirely white. It was a brochure for a bleak, overcrowded, low-income state-funded nursing home located in one of the most dangerous and impoverished neighborhoods in the city. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I told her that 5 years ago, she told me I needed to figure it out myself. I watched her entire spirit shatter into dust as I delivered the final devastating blow. "Now, it's your turn to figure it out," I said. I signaled for my security team to remove them from the property. The absolute silence that finally filled my seized mansion was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The physical eviction was only one battle in a much larger war. Donovan had spent 30 years building a powerful network of corrupt politicians and sleazy media executives who owed him massive favors. By Monday morning, his remaining loyal cronies launched a vicious, coordinated smear campaign across every major news network and social media platform in the city. They painted a disgusting, fabricated picture of me as a ruthless, greedy homewrecker who had maliciously stolen her father's holy empire. The tabloids ran horrible headlines calling me a vindictive sociopath who threw her own elderly, helpless parents out onto the streets simply to satisfy a childish grudge. They brought corrupt church elders onto morning talk shows to weep and lie about how my actions were destroying the community and dismantling decades of sacred charity work. The media attacks were incredibly aggressive and relentless. Reporters camped outside the gates of the Obsidian Capitol high-rise, shoving microphones in my face every time my security team escorted me to my car. My public relations team begged me to release a carefully worded written statement denying the claims and outlining my father's extensive criminal history. They wanted me to play the victim. But I absolutely refused to play their pathetic defensive games. Explaining myself to corrupt journalists was a complete waste of breath. True power never apologizes or asks for public validation. I decided it was time to change the entire narrative with a single undeniable action. I ordered my executive team to organize a massive live press conference for Tuesday afternoon. I specifically instructed them to hold the event right on the front lawn of the sprawling seized estate that Donovan had once called his personal holy palace. Dozens of news vans and hundreds of reporters swarmed the manicured lawns of the mansion. The air was thick with tension and greedy anticipation as I walked out the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped up to the polished wooden podium. The reporters immediately began shouting aggressively, trying to trap me with hostile questions about my supposed cruelty. I did not raise my hands to quiet them or show a single ounce of intimidation. I simply stood there, looking out over the sea of flashing cameras, wearing a sharp white tailored suit that perfectly reflected my absolute calm authority. I waited until the aggressive shouting completely died down and the journalists realized I was not going to react to their manufactured outrage. I looked directly into the primary television cameras and began to speak with cold, undeniable precision. I told the silent crowd that my father and his corrupt cronies had spent decades using this massive estate as a monument to their own wicked greed while pretending to serve the community. I reached into the inside pocket of my white blazer and pulled out the thick, heavy deed to the sprawling 20-acre property. I held the official legal document up high so every single camera could capture the embossed gold seal. I announced that I was completely liquidating the remaining pastoral assets and signing the entire estate over to a newly formed nonprofit trust. I told the shocked reporters that this massive mansion would no longer be a symbol of stolen wealth and spiritual manipulation. I declared that effective immediately, the entire property was being permanently transformed into a state-of-the-art technology and business incubator designed exclusively to fund and educate underprivileged Black women. The absolute stunned silence that washed over the crowd of journalists was deeply, incredibly satisfying. I outlined my comprehensive multi-million-dollar plan, explaining how the massive grand ballroom would be converted into a coding academy, and the sprawling luxury suites would become collaborative workspaces for female entrepreneurs. I told them that the millions of dollars Donovan had stolen from vulnerable working-class families would finally be returned to the community to build real generational wealth. I explained that Obsidian Capital would be providing limitless grants to women who had brilliant ideas but lacked the institutional support to bring them to life. The hostile energy of the press corps vanished instantly. The aggressive reporters who had just been calling me a ruthless villain were suddenly scrambling to ask me about my visionary philanthropic strategies. The narrative completely flipped right before my eyes. By the time the evening news aired, the vicious smear campaign was entirely dead. The media was universally hailing me as a brilliant corporate hero who had boldly dismantled a corrupt religious syndicate to empower marginalized women. The bitter winter wind howled against the cracked window of a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the absolute worst part of town. It was Christmas Eve, and the holiday cheer that illuminated the rest of the city was completely absent from this dark, depressing box. Donovan sat at a wobbly plastic folding table, staring blankly at a plate of cold canned ham and instant mashed potatoes. He looked incredibly old and completely broken. The expensive tailored suits he used to parade around in were gone, replaced by a stained gray sweatsuit that hung loosely off his shrunken frame. Camilla sat across from him, shivering in a moth-eaten sweater as she swatted a massive cockroach away from the edge of the kitchen counter. The air inside the tiny apartment was thick with the foul smell of stale grease and overwhelming despair. They had spent their entire lives stealing from the vulnerable to fund their lavish lifestyle. And now they were finally experiencing the exact same poverty they had always mocked. The federal justice system had not been kind to their precious golden boy. Preston was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary serving an 8-year sentence for fraud and conspiracy, while Serena had been handed a brutal 10-year sentence without the possibility of early parole. The only source of light in the dim room came from a tiny, outdated television sitting on top of a milk crate. The screen glowed brightly, broadcasting the annual end-of-the-year awards gala live from downtown. Donovan dropped his plastic fork as the television anchor cheerfully announced the highly anticipated Person of the Year. The camera panned across a glittering ballroom filled with the most elite and powerful figures in the city before settling on the stage. My face appeared on the screen, radiant and completely at peace. I was wearing a stunning floor-length crimson gown that perfectly caught the light as I accepted the prestigious award. The news anchor spoke glowingly about how I had completely revolutionized the city by transforming a massive seized estate into a multi-million-dollar technology incubator. They praised my corporate brilliance and my unmatched philanthropic vision. Donovan let out a choked, pathetic gasp as he watched the massive crowd give me a roaring standing ovation. His hands shook violently, and he squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch the glorious reality of his absolute defeat. Camilla sat frozen, staring at the television screen as tears began to stream down her hollow, sunken cheeks. She realized that I had not just defeated them, I had completely erased them from my own narrative. The contrast was too much for her fragile, greedy mind to handle. Camilla scrambled off her wobbly chair and frantically dug through her worn purse to find her cracked cell phone. Her hands trembled so badly she dropped the phone twice before finally managing to dial my personal number. She desperately needed to hear my voice. She wanted to throw one last pathetic guilt trip and manipulate me into feeling sorry for the monsters who had made my early life a living nightmare. I was standing outside on the expansive glass balcony of my luxury penthouse, breathing in the crisp, beautiful winter air. The glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out infinitely before me. The soft, elegant sounds of a live jazz band drifted out from inside my warm penthouse, mixing perfectly with the joyful sounds of the holiday season. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in my hand, feeling completely grounded and remarkably free. I felt my phone vibrate in the pocket of my silk coat. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. I saw Camilla's name flashing across the digital display. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or anxiety. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound calm. I tapped the screen and brought the phone up to my ear without saying a word. The sound of desperate, pathetic sobbing immediately filled the line. Camilla was crying so hard she was choking on her own tears. She wailed into the phone, begging me to listen to her. She cried out that they were completely ruined and starving in a filthy, roach-infested apartment. Her voice cracked as she screamed out her final desperate plea, asking me if I was happy now that I had finally won. She asked me if completely destroying her life and stealing her empire made me feel like a winner. She waited for me to yell or gloat or show any sign of emotional attachment to her suffering. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne and looked out over the glowing city. The wind gently brushed past my face as I spoke into the phone with absolute cold indifference. I was never competing with you, I told her quietly. I just came to take out the trash. I did not wait to hear her response. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ended the call, and permanently blocked her number from my life forever. The digital connection was severed, and with it, the very last tether to my dark past was completely destroyed. A bright, genuine smile spread across my face as I turned around and walked back through the sliding glass doors into my spectacular penthouse, surrounded by people who truly loved and respected me. I raised my glass to the beautiful, limitless future. Some people tell me I went too far by completely destroying my own family and leaving my parents in the slums. But they didn't live through the years of abuse, nor did they hear my own brother order a hit on my life. So, tell me, am I wrong for taking absolutely everything from them? Should I have shown mercy, or did they get exactly what they deserved? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next story.